have spent 40 years learning to listen to things that cannot speak for themselves. My father taught me on a bench in the back of his shop, holding a dying pocket watch up to my ear, and telling me the truth wasn't in what the thing said. It was in what it didn't say. A clock that ticks even and wrong is easy. A clock that ticks strange and right, you have to earn. My husband used to say I loved machines more than people, and for a long while after he passed, I let him be right. It was easier to sit with a gear train that only asked patience of me, than with people who asked things I no longer knew how to give. So when the Soreth offered contract passage for an off-world instrument keeper willing to tend a palace tower nobody else wanted, I put my tools in a crate and went, and I did not look back, and nobody up here ever asked me to. I never thought that trade would carry me across the stars, but here I was anyway, an old widow with flower-white hair and ink-stained fingers, keeper of the lower clock tower in a palace that had forgotten it owned one. Nobody came up my stair unless something below had stopped working and somebody remembered, eventually, that Agnes Doyle still lived up there among the gears. That is how the boy from the council office found me on a cold morning, out of breath from 4 flights of stone steps, asking if I would come down at once. The crown prince was dying, he said, or something worse than dying. Nobody could agree which. I did not ask why they wanted a clockmaker. I have learned not to ask that question. I simply put down the escapement I was truing, took my satchel of picks and probes, and followed him down into a part of the palace I had never once been permitted to see. A steward stopped us twice on the stairs, once to ask what business a tower servant had in the royal wing, and once, more sharply, to tell the boy he had clearly fetched the wrong woman. The boy only shook his head and kept walking, and I kept walking behind him, because I had already decided that whatever was waiting down there needed listening to a great deal more than it needed my papers checked. They had the prince in a chamber with the windows shuttered, and 6 of the Soreth court's finest healers standing around his bed like men guarding a wound they were afraid to touch. He was young, 20, perhaps 21 in his own years, with that warm bronze-gold skin his people carry, and faint points of soft inner light scattered across it like a sky caught under the surface of him. He looked, more than anything, like a boy trying very hard not to be frightened in front of an audience. His father, the emperor, stood at the foot of the bed, a tall man carved out of patience that had long since worn thin. He told me, in a voice pitched carefully level, that his son's heart had begun keeping a second time, not a flutter, not a skip. An entire second rhythm, steady and separate, ticking alongside the first, like 2 clocks bolted to the same wall and refusing to agree. The healers wanted to open his chest and silence it before it spread, whatever it was. I asked if I might listen first. 6 healers looked at me the way men look at a mop that has wandered into a boardroom. But the emperor, who had clearly run out of better ideas, only nodded once and stepped back. I did not have their instruments. I had what I always have, a horn of turned wood, waxed smooth on the inside, no bigger than a drinking cup, that I used to hear a mainspring's true voice from 3 rooms away. I have pressed it against ship hulls and church bells, and the chest of a dying grandfather clock older than this palace's youngest wing. I pressed it now, gently, against the prince's ribs, and told him, quiet as I could, that I only wanted to listen the way I listened to everything else, not to fix him, just to hear him. He was still shaking when I started. By the 3rd slow breath, he wasn't. The first night I heard only what the healers had already heard, 2 rhythms, out of step, a lurching double time that sounded, to an untrained ear, exactly like a mechanism about to fail. But I have spent my whole life learning the difference between a machine that is breaking and one that has simply never been heard correctly. A clock striking 13 isn't always broken. Sometimes it's only telling a different hour than the one you expected. I asked to come back the 2nd night, and the 3rd. I sat on a low stool by his bed with my horn and my notebook, the way I have sat beside 100 stubborn old timepieces, and I did nothing dramatic at all. I hummed sometimes, low, the way I hum over a bench when a gear train won't settle. I told him, between listenings, about the tower clock that used to run 4 minutes fast every autumn, until I discovered it wasn't broken. It simply swelled in the damp and needed a different kind of patience, not a different kind of repair. He laughed, once, weakly, and said no one had ever explained anything to him as though he weren't already dying. The healers came and went during those nights, taking their readings, murmuring in a language of numbers I didn't share. I kept to my own method. I would rest the horn against his ribs and simply wait, the way I wait out a spring before I decide whether it's failing, or only finding its rest position. On the 4th night he asked me, half joking, half not, whether I was frightened of him. I told him the truth, that I had once spent 3 weeks sitting beside a broken astronomical clock 4 centuries old, waiting for it to tell me what was wrong with it, and that patience had never once frightened me, whatever waited at the end of it. By the fifth night I understood what I was hearing. The second rhythm was not chasing the first, the way a failing heart chases a healthy one trying to catch up before it stops. It was keeping its own time entirely. Slower, deeper, patient, the way an old foundation clock keeps time under a newer mechanism built above it. It was not fighting his heart. It was accompanying it. I had read enough, by then, borrowing books from a dust-covered shelf no one else had opened in years, to know the shape of what I was hearing. The Soreth bloodline, generations back, before the wars thinned it, had carried a second inner rhythm as a mark of certain old lines, a trait the healers of this age had never once been trained to recognize, because it had not surfaced in living memory. They had a name for every disease. They had no name at all for a boy simply becoming, at last, entirely himself. I told the Emperor plainly, the way I'd tell a customer his watch didn't need melting down for scrap. His son was not dying. His son's body was doing something old and rare and entirely his own, and it only looked like breaking because no one alive had heard it done right before. I will not pretend the room went quiet in some grand cinematic way. It didn't. The healers argued, one of them quite loudly, that a tower servant's old wood horn was no instrument of medicine, and ought never to have been brought near a royal bed at all. The Emperor asked me 4 times if I was certain, and I told him the truth each time, as certain as an old woman can be who has spent her whole life learning to trust her own ears over other people's fear. He was quiet a long moment after the 4th answer, studying me the way he might have studied a report he didn't want to believe but couldn't quite dismiss. In the end, it was the prince himself who settled it, sitting up against his pillows and saying, in a voice steadier than I'd yet heard from him, that it didn't feel like dying. It felt, he said, like finally hearing his own name spoken correctly for the first time. They did not give me a title. I did not want one. What the prince gave me instead, some weeks later, once the shaking in his hands had stopped and the color had come back honest into his face, was an open door. He asked, a little shyly for a crown prince, if I would come and wind his own chamber clocks myself from now on, and sit with him a while whenever the second rhythm worried him in the night, not as a servant summoned, as the one person in that whole glittering palace who had ever simply listened. I still climb those same stone steps most evenings now, an old woman with a wooden horn in her satchel, on my way to sit beside a young man who is learning, slowly, to stop being afraid of his own heartbeat. Nobody announces me when I arrive. Nobody needs to. I have spent 40 years listening to things that could not speak for themselves. It turns out that was never really about the clocks.